Thousands of Africans across the continent came together under the powerful slogan, "Hands off the AES," to show their support for Burkina Faso and its revolutionary leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Protests took place in Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Liberia, led by grassroots groups and people's movements. Their message to France and the US was clear: fix your own problems at home. Leave Africa alone. Now that a new leader is rising who truly serves the interests of his people, suddenly America is involved again. But people are fed up. Enough is enough. In the spring of 2025, thousands of people flooded the streets of major U.S. cities in protest. They waved not only American flags, but also those of Burkina Faso. The name on everyone's lips was Ibrahim Traoré, the 37-year-old leader of the West African country. His bold stance against imperialism brought parts of the U.S. to a standstill, blocking roads and drawing national attention, so much so that even President Donald Trump was caught off guard by the size and passion of the movement. How did a young leader from a small African country that many Americans hadn't even heard of inspire protests across the U.S.? Why were people marching for him? Captain Ibrahim Traoré isn't just another African leader. At just 37, he's become a symbol of a new generation of African revolutionaries, leaders who are saying no more to Western interference. After taking power in Burkina Faso through a military takeover in 2022, Traoré made bold moves that shook Western powers. He kicked out French troops. He cut military ties with France. He partnered with Russia. Most importantly, he started speaking openly about African self-determination, sparking hope and pride among millions across the continent and the global African diaspora. Unlike many leaders before him who stayed quiet or played along with former colonial powers, Traoré calls out the double standards. He questions why Africa remains poor, while its natural resources keep making European companies richer. He asks why African nations still need approval from Paris to make their own decisions. This isn't just politics, it's a movement, a new consciousness that's spreading fast. That's why on April 30th, 2025, something unexpected happened. What began as solidarity protests in Africa quickly spread to cities across the US, Europe, and wherever people of African descent live. These weren't small or symbolic marches. These were massive protests that shut down major roads, stalled traffic, and forced the Trump administration to pay attention. But what triggered it all? It started with news of a supposed coup attempt against Traoré's government. Whether it was a real coup or something staged, one thing stood out: there were clear signs of Western intelligence involvement. The same kind of pattern seen before in Libya, Syria, and other countries where leaders dared to defy the West. Then things escalated. General Michael Langley, head of U.S. Africa Command AFRICOM, made controversial remarks during a Senate hearing. He accused Captain Traoré of using Burkina Faso's $4 billion in gold reserves not for the country, but to protect his regime. He painted Traoré as a dictator hoarding wealth instead of helping his people. But this kind of talk reminded many people of the lies told before the fall of Libya. They said they were going to save Libya. Look at it now. It's in ruins compared to the days of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, with Traoré standing up for his people, America is back again, trying to control the narrative. If the U.S. really wanted to help, why not go to South Sudan? Why not help in Congo? If America truly wanted to fix things, they would start with their own problems before pretending to save Burkina Faso. North Ghana Bay is saying they need help and that Burkina Faso should be left alone. That's exactly what we're saying. The timing of these statements was no accident. They came just days after the alleged coup attempt, leading many to believe this was part of a coordinated propaganda push to justify another regime change in Africa. But this time, the African diaspora didn't stay silent. They said, enough is enough. Protests erupted under the powerful slogan, "Hands off AES," referring to the alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All three countries had expelled French forces and started carving out an independent path, one that clearly upset the Western powers. What shocked many was how fast these protests came together. Within just days of the coup attempt, organizers across continents had mobilized thousands. This wasn't some slow, grassroots build-up, it was a rapid, coordinated wave of resistance that showed the true strength of global Pan-African unity. In the digital age, the message, crystal clear, leave Ibrahim Traoré alone. Africa is for Africans. These weren't just catchphrases. They were battle cries, a rallying call for a generation sick of watching their continent being used and abused by foreign powers. When these protests reached American cities, they didn't follow the usual playbook. They didn't stick to designated zones or keep it safe and silent. These were bold, disruptive actions that forced the nation to look and listen. In cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, thousands poured into the streets. But they weren't just marching, they were blocking intersections, shutting down highways, and bringing everyday business to a grinding halt. And what made these protests truly powerful? The diversity of the crowd. It wasn't just recent African immigrants. It was third and fourth generation African Americans, Caribbean Americans, and allies from every background, united under one cause. This wasn't about nationality, it was about identity, justice, and unity. The chants echoed through the streets. Ibrahim Traoré, our hero. Africa is rising from Burkina Faso to the USA. Hands off Africa, today and always. But at the heart of it all was something deeper: frustration with America's foreign policy in Africa. For far too long, the African diaspora in the U.S. has watched their ancestral lands be exploited, destabilized, and drained by the same Western nations that preach about democracy and human rights. This wasn't just about defending one leader. It was about defending African dignity, self-determination, and the freedom to shape their own future without outside interference. And here's where things get really interesting. President Trump's response to the protests, totally unexpected. At first, according to sources inside the administration, he brushed it off, dismissing reports from his advisors about some African protests happening in American cities. He didn't think much of it, but he was in for a surprise. Trump's reaction at first. President Trump didn't take the protests seriously, but once the full scale and intensity became clear, his attitude shifted fast. During an emergency briefing, he reportedly told his advisors, "I can't believe this." What caught Trump off guard wasn't just how big the protests were, it was how organized and effective they had become. This wasn't some one-day flash mob. These were well-coordinated, strategic demonstrations that even veteran political insiders found impressive. Sources say Trump grew more and more irritated as he was briefed on why so many people, especially across the U.S., were showing support for Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The idea that a young African military leader could inspire that level of loyalty and mass mobilization inside the U.S. was something Trump never saw coming. But what really got under his skin? It wasn't just that people were defending Burkina Faso. The protesters were calling out U.S. foreign policy directly and loudly. Everywhere he looked, there were signs that read, "Hands off Africa. Stop U.S. interference." For a president who prides himself on strength and control, it was deeply unsettling. American cities were being disrupted not for domestic issues, but in solidarity with a foreign leader he couldn't influence. And how did the Trump administration respond? Not with the usual angry tweets or dramatic statements. Instead, there was silence, a calculated, almost nervous silence. Behind the scenes, however, it was a different story. Emergency meetings were held at the State Department. Officials were scrambling to figure out how to respond to something they had never faced before: massive, organized Pan-African solidarity on U.S. soil. For decades, U.S. policy in Africa had been carried out quietly, with little pushback from within the country. The African diaspora in America had never been this unified or politically active on foreign policy. That changed overnight. State Department insiders admitted they were shocked by the speed and coordination. One official called it unprecedented. Diaspora mobilization. The concern wasn't just about the protests themselves. It was about what they represented: a politically aware, emotionally invested, and strategically capable community ready to challenge the status quo. Foreign policy experts who'd spent years working on Africa with little public attention suddenly found themselves under pressure. Think tanks, policy institutions, and elite panels that usually discussed Africa behind closed doors were now facing protesters outside their events, being called out publicly, and confronted with facts and demands by informed activists, organizations like the Africa Society, Council on Foreign Relations, and others were no longer able to operate in silence. One former State Department official admitted bluntly, "We're not used to having passionate, organized communities weighing in on Africa. This changes everything." These protests also exposed something uncomfortable for America's foreign policy establishment: the huge gap between what America says it stands for and what it actually does in Africa. When protesters chanted against neocolonialism and accused the U.S. of backing coup attempts while claiming to support democracy, it hit a nerve, because they were pointing out a truth that's usually buried in policy papers and polite diplomatic language. So were the protesters wrong? Not really. For decades, Western powers have used economic pressure, political manipulation, and military involvement in Africa, often disguised as aid or partnership. France, in particular, has held tight control over its former colonies through the CFA franc currency system and a web of military bases. But something is shifting. A new generation of African leaders is rising, leaders who are rejecting neocolonialism completely and choosing freedom, self-reliance, and dignity over dependence and control. This awakening isn't just happening in Burkina Faso. Mali and Niger have taken similar paths. And now, other African countries are watching closely, rethinking their own relationships with Western powers. The April 30th protests made one thing clear: this African awakening has a powerful diaspora dimension. On the tens of millions of people of African descent living in the US, Europe, and other parts of the West are no longer silent spectators. They're organized, they're mobilized, and they're willing to take bold, disruptive action to support African leaders who stand up against foreign domination. This marks a major shift in how African foreign policy will work going forward. Western governments can no longer interfere in African countries without considering the political backlash from their own African diaspora populations. But one of the most surprising things about these massive protests, mainstream American media barely covered them, despite blocking highways, disrupting major U.S. cities, and becoming one of the largest Pan-African mobilizations in years. Most big news outlets were silent. CNN gave the protests a brief mention in a segment about foreign influence on American streets. MSNBC hardly touched them. Fox News focused mostly on the traffic disruptions and the fact that foreign flags were being waved. This media blackout didn't feel like an accident. Mainstream media has a long track record of ignoring Africa unless it's about war, poverty, or Western intervention. Stories about African leadership, resistance, or self-determination almost never make the cut. But while traditional media stayed quiet, alternative media lit up. Independent journalists, African diaspora platforms, and social media creators gave the protests the spotlight they deserved. YouTube channels, Instagram lives, TikTok clips, and podcasts filled the gap. In many cases, the reporting was more in-depth, more passionate, and more informed than anything coming from major networks. Hashtags like #HandsOffTRA or eAcute and #AfricaRising trended for days, with videos from the protests going viral across platforms. And this dynamic revealed something powerful. The African diaspora doesn't need mainstream media to tell its stories anymore. They've built their own media ecosystem, fast, connected, and capable of mobilizing global action without waiting for approval from traditional gatekeepers. The U.S. protests were just one part of a larger global movement. On April 30th, thousands took to the streets in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, waving Burkinabe and Russian flags, chanting, "Long live Traoré." Similar demonstrations were held in Ghana, Liberia, and London, where protesters rallied outside the U.S. Embassy, denouncing both General Langley's comments and the alleged coup attempt. These global protests weren't just reactions, they were a clear rejection of Western interference in African affairs. For many, Traoré represents something more, a new kind of African leadership. willing to say no to exploitation. On social media, posts poured in, "The West doesn't hate dictators. They hate leaders who say no to exploitation. Traoré is continuing Sankar's legacy, that's why they fear him." These messages struck a chord with protesters in the US and around the world. The hashtag Hands Off Africa went global, connecting activists across continents. In Europe, especially in London, the protests mirrored what was happening in the US. On April 30th, hundreds gathered outside the American embassy holding signs like, "Stop Destabilizing Africa." Videos showed speakers praising Traoré's courage and calling for an end to Western sanctions on Burkina Faso. This wave of global solidarity gave the U.S. protests even more strength and urgency. But the effects didn't stop at protests. Governments across the Western world began to worry. In Paris, French officials watched nervously as diaspora communities began organizing protests of their own. The movement spread to London, Brussels, Berlin, and other cities with large African populations. For European countries that have long depended on Africa's resources and the loyalty of compliant African leaders, this new, organized diaspora resistance posed a serious challenge. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly held emergency meetings with his advisors, asking how the leader of a small African nation had managed to inspire global mobilization. The impact wasn't just felt in the West. In Africa, the protests sparked a new wave of questioning. Seeing people across the globe stand with Burkina Faso, many began asking, why aren't our own leaders standing up to the West? In Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and other West African countries, civil society groups began organizing their own solidarity events. And most importantly, the protests, a cultural renaissance. At these protests made something very clear: the days of Western powers quietly orchestrating regime change in Africa are over. Any future interference will now face immediate, organized, global resistance from African diaspora communities that can quickly mobilize and even disrupt the centers of power in the West. This marks a real shift in global power dynamics. African voices, once suppressed or ignored, now have a global support system that can respond in real time to any threat against their sovereignty. But beyond the political impact, something deeper and more powerful was set in motion: a cultural awakening. The protests sparked a Pan-African Renaissance, a revival of identity, pride, and historical memory. Signs at the protests referenced great historical leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Marcus Garvey, placed side by side with today's rising figure, Ibrahim Traoré. This was no coincidence. The message was clear: this isn't just a moment, it's a movement. And it's part of a long legacy of African resistance and self-determination. Legacy of the Traoré protests. Traoré protests left a deep mark on the U.S. They proved that a young leader from a small West African nation could inspire action across the globe, uniting diverse communities in a shared fight for justice. For many African American activists, these protests were a moment of connection, linking their struggles at home with global movements for liberation. For Pan-Africanists, Traoré symbolized hope, a vision of an Africa that stands tall, free from outside control. The protests also challenged U.S. foreign policy. Protesters demanded a change of foreign policy that respects African sovereignty. And they weren't alone. More and more Americans are beginning to question the role their country plays in global conflicts. From Iraq to Libya to Burkina Faso, the protest signs didn't just mention Burkina's gold. They mentioned oil in the Middle East, cobalt in the Congo, and natural resources worldwide, all pointing to the exploitative patterns of global economics. For President Trump and other Western leaders, this was a wake-up call. They saw something they hadn't expected: a new kind of political force. This wasn't just about African immigrants. It was a coalition of African Americans, the African diaspora, anti-imperialist organizers, and everyday citizens, all united by one cause: justice. This movement could shape future elections, reshape policy debates, and transform how the U.S. and other countries engage with Africa. The 2025 Traoré protests were more than just a response. They were a statement that even from thousands of miles away, a young African leader could inspire people to take to the streets, demanding dignity, sovereignty, and truth. From Chicago to New York, people chanted in unison, the fight for a better world doesn't stop at borders. Looking ahead, these protests have set new standards for how the African diaspora engages with politics and global affairs. They've begun to shift the world's perception of African agency, unity, and leadership. Because when marginalized people find their voice and their power, everything changes. The Ibrahim Traoré solidarity movement isn't just about one leader. It's about a new generation, a new energy, and a global awakening that will shape African and world politics for decades to come. The real question now isn't if this movement will continue. It's how far will it go? Will this movement transform the relationship between Africa and the world? Can Traoré's vision lead to real, lasting change? Or will it face the same obstacles that past revolutionaries did? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the Traoré protests will change U.S. foreign policy? Will this be the movement that finally reshapes global power? If you want more unfiltered stories about Traoré's rise, global shakeups, and the truths mainstream media won't touch, smash that like button and subscribe now. This story is far from over, and the next chapter might just shake the world again.